Welcome, everyone. I am delighted to be joined today by Vernon Smith, who is a professor appointed to the School of Business and Economics and the School of Law at Chapman University. Vernon was awarded the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his work in experimental economics. Vernon has written nearly 400 articles and books on a wide range of topics from 1957 to the present. I have prepared some questions in the hope of giving an overview of his work and also to show the relevance of Vernon's work to many of the most complex and modern issues. Throughout the conversation, we will be talking about Adam Smith, complexity theory, Web3, public choice theory, economics as a field, and I will not resist asking some more personal questions at the end. Vernon, I couldn't be happier to have you on, so thank you very much for making the time, and without further ado, I suggest we get started. The first question is the following. I want to conduct this interview under the auspice of Adam Smith. So let me start with the obvious. You have said once that the theory of the moral sentiments is Smith's most important book. The question is, please explain why.
Well, it's interesting that Adam Smith thought it was his most important book. And his biographies all report that fact, and I think he's right. The Theory of Moral Sentiments is really a book about society. It's the creation of, you see, Adam Smith was very much aware of the existence of order everywhere. There's order in the universe, there's order in our neighborhoods, and he basically models that. In an important passage, he asked us to imagine that a member of our species is brought up without any contact with another member of the species. And he points out that that person can know more about what it means for his or her mind to be deformed than for the face to be deformed. And then he uses the metaphor of a mirror. He says, give this person a mirror for examining for society, and that person now is able to know what it means for the face to be deformed, what it means for a mind to be deformed, and all of this comes from his interaction with others. And that begins, in Smith's view, that begins in earnest about the time we first have playfellows. That because our playfellows are not, as he says, are not as indulgent of our actions as our parents and close family. And so he calls that our first entry into the great school of self-command. And a key concept in Adam Smith is this notion of self-command, that we learn to control and moderate our own behavior in the light of how we come off to others. You see, the images that we project to others, we become aware of, and that sort of disciplines how our actions. And you see, and in Smith, actions are of two kinds. There's the good things we do for each other in our communities, and then there's the bad things we do to each other, and these have to be controlled. And our instincts are to punish. We resent deliberately hurtful actions, and that resentment leads to the urge to punish, to sort of retaliate. That's our automatic response. And so the whole notion of justice, beneficence is about the good things, justice is about the control and elimination of the bad things we do to each other. And really the concept of property comes from that. The notion that, and this involves murder. What are the really bad things? It's murder, theft, robbery, violation of contract. Those are kind of the main four categories. And well, if murder is rampant, it means we have no property in our bodies, you see. Until there's some control of that, we acquire them property in our own persons. Theft and robbery, unless those are controlled, we do not have property in the products of our body and mind. And if contracts are readily violated, then we don't have property in the promises that we make to each other. So those are kind of the basic ideas behind justice in Adam Smith. And these really are at the most fundamental way, fundamental level, are about property. And of course, and so out of this comes a theory of society. And as between beneficence and justice, justice is much the more important, because if people are at all times ready to hurt and injure each other, then you really can't have a society. So that is the more important of the two. Now, modern notions of justice include distributional justice. Well, that's in Smith, that's about beneficence. That's not about justice. So there's this clean distinction between rules that govern the good things that we do for each other and rules that control and limit the bad things we do to each other. So that's why, I mean, that's a sort of a long-winded summary, but that's the essence, you see, to me, of the theory of moral sentiments. And it's very fundamental. I think he saw, see, once he understood the origins of society and where society comes from, then he could talk about economy. So then his second book is The Wealth of Nations. But I think the first is much more the more important and basic. And I think it's a book, unfortunately, that economists have not read. Philosophers have. You know, there's a literature in philosophy that recognizes the importance of the theory of moral sentiments. But economists have not read it. And moreover, when they have read it and written about it, it's clear to me they didn't understand it. I mean, a good example is Jacob Viner, the arguably one of the great historians of economic thought. He has an essay on Adam Smith, and he discusses the theory of moral sentiments, which he says it's not a significant book. The great book is The Wealth of Nations.
Mm.
And so economists have either not read it, or if they have read it, have dealt with it in a superficial way.
So you've mentioned economists and the way they approach the theory of moral sentiments. I want to ask you questions about the field of economic theory, but before, you also mentioned human society and the fact that indeed the economy is made out of human being, which is not something you can abstract away. And here on that subject, I want to quote a short paragraph of your Nobel lecture. So in this lecture, you said that we have become accustomed to the idea that a natural system, like the human body, regulates itself. To explain regulation, you say we look for feedback loops rather than a central planning or directing body. But somehow, our intuitions about self-regulation do not carry over to the artificial systems of human society. End of quote. This makes me curious about the following. What is your take on complexity theory, complexity economics, and its tools such as agent-based modelings? Or to put it differently, how does it compare to or complement experimental economics?
We're accustomed to order everywhere, but we sort of take it for granted. We don't know where it comes from. That is, there's nothing in our education and our training that makes it clear what the origins of order are. We just pick up in a historical context what is, and of course we have people are everywhere following rules that bring order, but we don't have this sense of where this order, what its origins are, and which I think is why it's so important to read Adam Smith, which is still by far the best on this of all of the modern. I think that I read Adam Smith for guidelines to what to expect from experiments, because it's very relevant. His propositions on beneficence and justice have application directly to neighborhoods, and to laboratory experiments. And Adam Smith has not, you see, been used in that way. And he is he's dealing with very complex phenomena which are solved by people using fairly simple day-to-day rules and in their interactions. And so I think that is in a way kind of the tip-off of kind of what's most interesting about complexity theory, that organisms can, using with strictly local knowledge and the local link long knowledge, of course, gives you a much broader expanse of knowledge, and being able to relate locally to others and through networks, you achieve order and also progress. I mean, because much of the order has to do with changes and not just static states. And I think the complexity theory, and I'm certainly not an expert on that. My reading is really very limited in the formal literature on complexity theory. But I think one of the important themes is complex solutions from quite simple rules uh, of interaction in groups. And then, of course, there's wonderful examples of that in colonies of ants and bees, the low, really fairly low levels, and even microorganisms. So that order is everywhere. And as Adam Smith, it's due to the great author of nature. He often spoke of God as the author of nature. And his idea, interestingly, is he thinks of there being a supreme intelligence behind everything in the universe. But how do humans learn about things from day to day on the ground? And there he talks about nature and the rules of nature that govern sort of the way in which we discover things. So that, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet the possessions of thy neighbor. These rules, you see, are of ancient origin. People didn't know where they came from. So it's natural to think, well, they must have been given by Moses on a mountaintop. They have a narrative, you see, that people have this desire to understand. They're curious about origins and things. And of course, in antiquity, these answers were very simple and based upon a sense of that there must be a designer behind all of this design. You see, that notion of design implying a designer is kind of the origins of the notions of God. And Adam Smith was he was Christian. He once, in one of his passages, he refers to our Savior. Well, he was in that sense a Christian, although he had these much more comprehensive ideas about how the forms in which design become evident in human affairs. So yes, complexity, and of course complexity is in both of Adam Smith's books. The notion that whole economies are driven by bottom-up processes and involving the rules that we follow, that actually require a fair and free economies of the world require very little explicit enforcement because most people voluntarily follow. They don't steal and they don't inflict harm on others. They generally find it in their interests to do favorable things for others, and of course that those favorable actions toward others lead people to want to reward those actions. And so we have reciprocity coming out of the beneficence propositions that you find in Adam Smith. So yes, complexity, very complex systems can be governed by these bottom-up rules. It's sort of remarkable.
Mm. And often simple rules. One of the great saying in complexity science is that the sum is greater than its parts, which means that then you need to understand the role of each of the part or each of the agents. If I quote Adam Smith, human being, they have a tendency to seek to be loved, but also to be lovely, right? Which may explain a lot of the emergence that you
Yes.
see. So, and talking about complexity and the role and the importance of those very simple interactions leads me to a potential technological translation of those principles, that is Web3. And it seems to me that indeed in a Web3 environment, and I will explain what I mean by that, the role of each agent is more important than in a Web2 environment. Let me explain. I've heard you describe Uber, the company, as a great example of a company that can help spontaneous order emerge through an algorithm. Now, of course, there is a company here, Uber, behind the algorithm. So in a sense, spontaneous order is organized not by a government, but by a powerful company. And in response, some people are advocating for Web3, in which the transactions are organized without a centralized entity, and where you will see that users transact directly with each other using a protocol. Now, you've been running a decentralization workshop for years, so your experience can be very useful to the field. And here's my question. What's your take on Web3? Or in other words, what's your take on decentralizing the economy? And I guess that leads us to answer whether or not we are too dependent on the big tech companies in 2023.
Well, Thibault, I think the Web3, what little I know of it, is really quite exciting because it, as you indicate, the first uh, internet application was read-only, and then we had read-write, and now we have read-write own. We have much more where people can. They're protected. Their privacy is protected through blockchain technology, but there's this complete freedom to interact with others and actually to create. I mean, there's protocols, but they can actually create routines within that. It's open to that, and you see this reminds me of when I first went to Arizona. That was in 1975. That's when we first went electronic in experiments. Up to that time, all of the experiments involved passing out paper instructions, paper forms to be filled out, returned, and then redistributed in any kind of ongoing decision framework. Well, at the University of Arizona, I had a mixed class of undergraduates and graduates, and my kind of standard way of teaching experimental economics was to have the students present papers that they read, and each had the idea was that they would, by the end of the semester, come up with experiments and even could, if not in that class, in follow-on classes, actually pursue those experiments and do them. Well, so I don't know, it was about the second or third week, and the students were, through this literature, were finding out what experiments were. And I had Mike Vanoni was a junior engineer, mechanical engineer in my class. He raised his hand and he said, Professor Smith, do you know about this Plato computer system over in the library? And I said, no. He said, well, he says, I think that's a teaching computer, but he said, I think it would be great for doing these kinds of experiments on.
Mm.
So I said, well, let's go find out. So it was a small class, about 10. And so I made an appointment with the person in charge of that, and we went over to the library, and he gave a demonstration of this Plato computer system. Control Data Corporation had been instrumental in helping to develop it, but interesting, it was pretty advanced. It had a plasma screen that was touch sensitive and a grid on it. So you could communicate not only through the keyboard, but through a touch sensitive screen. And of course, this is before the modern, the computer monitors that we had. So that ended up being the class project. Right then, I said, okay, if you guys are interested in this, go for it. And it was very exciting. And I often tell that story because I get credit for taking the field of experimental economics into this new electronic technology. I didn't do it, these students did. And although I've told that story, people still think of me as the instrument that did it, whereas I was the learner, and they were as much the teachers as I was. It was one of those very exciting classes, and experimental economics has lent itself very, very well to that sort of thing, because it's not entirely literature based. We have now a literature that we can draw on, but it's a practice based. And one of the things that I've discovered about in reading Adam Smith, that he's a source of his thought process, and the propositions have application to experimental environments. And I in my book with Bart Wilson on humanomics, we sort of developed that theme, pointing out that the ultimatum, and particularly the trust games that have been going on now since about 1990, were a puzzle. Why were people so cooperative? You're matched with somebody at random. You'll never know who it is. You're going to play this two-person game exactly once. You're either the first mover or the second mover, a random choice. And what's remarkable is the extent to which people resist defection in their own interest to take advantage of the other person. And that is very hard to explain or understand in terms of the kind of the standard model in economics. But Smith has a proposition, beneficence proposition 1. He says actions of a beneficent tendency alone deserve reward because of the gratitude we feel for this other person's actions. And And Bart and I were using the theory of moral sentiments in a law class. We had been assigning it, and we all of a sudden realized, wait a minute, that explains the trust game. Because you're the second mover, the first mover moved passed to you, that person didn't have to do that. The stakes were doubled as a result of that person passing because there's built in this notion of there's some synergy between these two individuals. So together they can do more than each alone. And the process of if one passes to two, rather than taking the equilibrium play out, then person two can either cooperate or defect. Well, about 2/3 of the people cooperate, only about 1/3 defect and take most of the money for themselves. And so it fits, that proposition fits it perfectly. And then we began to read the propositions and Adam Smith from the perspective, well, what does this imply in regard to the design of experiment, and will the outcomes be as Smith predicts? So, we report a number of experiments in that book that no one would have thought of doing if they hadn't read the theory of moral sentiments. You see, and so at some point you begin to realize that, wait a minute, this guy's thought processes, let's try to understand that, because his thinking is really quite clear and very relevant to issues today, just as much as it was, you see, 250 years ago. Of course, this year we're celebrating the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith birth. He was born in 1723. Now, Newton didn't die until 1727. So you see, you had Isaac Newton living past Adam Smith's birth, not long. David Hume would have been about age of 17 or 18, I think, when Isaac Newton died. So that the shadow, the figure of Isaac Newton, was very strong in 18th century Scotland, and it was very exciting period then, with David Hume working out some of the philosophical and methodological consequences of the idea in Newton that observations could be explained by hidden forces. See, this whole notion that there are things that we don't see that are hidden from us, but those forces can be modeled and account for what we see. You see, that's the kind of visionary thinking that Isaac Newton brought to physics and astronomy. And I see the Scottish Enlightenment as a working out of that idea in human systems, in political, legal, social, and economic systems. And I think that's what makes about 45 years of in Edinburgh and other parts of Scotland so exciting, because there are not only very very smart people that are picking up on that idea, but they're also very close observers. Adam Smith was a very close observer of circumstances around him and of what businessmen were doing, and a close follower of sort of a lot of practice going on in legal, social, and business systems around him. And he saw order in all of that. So this is right at the heart of modern complexity theory. Smith was dealing with it without any, of course, the tools of experiment, the computer tools, all of the tools that we have now. But the thinking, you see, is his thinking and methodological devices apply very much in today's world. So you see, an interesting thing about Adam Smith, he distinguished being self-interested from acting self-interestedly. We don't do that today. We think of actions are motivated by the consequences of those actions. Whereas in Smith, these were distinct enterprises, origins and consequences. And of course, he's able to see that the origins of economy are in the trades we make with each other. And that has the unintended consequence of producing prices that enable people to specialize. And they specialize across markets, you see, and are guided simply by their own interests to decide what to do, how to do it, in free societies, and he saw that as that sort of defines classical liberalism, and he saw that as the great source of wealth creation, and so it led to insights, his methodological views and distinctions that he made, which distinguished origins and consequences on the one hand, and one way of thinking, and also distinguishing being self-interested and acting self-interestedly, because his whole model of society is not based on altruism at all. He says we're all strictly self-interested, but he says you can't look your neighbor in the face and avow that all your decisions are self-interested and that all your actions are self-interested, because they won't like it and you won't be able to get along with your neighbor. So that's right there is the heart of his approach to, you see, why it is that we follow orderly bottom-up rules that produce order in society, because it comes right out of those propositions. So it's and so when it comes to so everyone is self-interested in the theory of moral sentiments, but that doesn't keep them from taking actions that are sensitive to the feelings of others. And when it comes to the wealth of nations, he's just carrying forward this notion that each person basically defines his own interest in his own way. And of course, if people read only the wealth of nations, they have all kinds of they get all kinds of ideas that are just not correct.
Mm.
For example, Smith says that every man, so long as he does not violate the rules of justice, should be perfectly free to pursue his own interest in his own way. People have tended to read that and say, well, we're all self-interested and greedy, and Smith's whole model is based upon, you know, the pursuit of self-interest and greed. And that's not what it says at all, because, you know, he's very careful to say, right up front, he says we're free so long as we don't violate the rules of justice. And then what we do, we pursue our own interests in our own way. Well, he's leaving lots of room for people at ground level to decide what their interest is and how to pursue it. And if you read the Theory of Moral Sentiments before you read The Wealth of Nations, you're sort of prepared for that, and for some of that language that in The Wealth of Nations reflects his propositional thinking and about the origins of society. So it's I've come to see the two works as being very very complementary to each other, and in your Web3 complexity, I think these books are directly relevant, you see, to what's happening there technologically. And and this Web3, I'm telling you, it's going to have a life of its own. I'm sure we're going to be astonished at what people do with that. Just as when we first went electronic in our experiments, what did we think we were doing? We thought we were going to make it easier to do experiments on the computer. We would also have the data recorded accurately, and we could run longer and more ambitious experiments. So it was going to facilitate that. What we didn't realize is that this tool was going to change the way we thought about experiments, because now we could do things that were so infeasible before we didn't even pursue them. And I think anything new like this, that's exactly what people are going to follow their curiosity, and they're going to use these the opportunities made available in Web3 in ways that will be very difficult to predict or anticipate. So that's why I find it pretty exciting.
So it seems to me that the theory of moral sentiments can indeed explain how agents behave in an economic system. So in a sense, it can inform complexity economics. And going back to Web3, here the idea might be that you will see emergent behaviors that will indeed come as a surprise to some of us who have argued, and I did not, but I hear that a lot, that without a centralized entity, there is no chance of getting to a sustainable organization of market or firms or transactions, that people will indeed just pursue their self-interest to the death of the ecosystem, which is not what Adam Smith is showing. So indeed, I will recommend to anyone in the space to have a look at the theory of the moral sentiments. Now, I want to switch from the more technological translation of Adam Smith to potentially what it means in terms of institutions. You are, among other things, a professor of law and economics, as I said in the introduction to this conversation, which brings me naturally to your work on institution and experimental public choice. And here again, I will quote you. You once said that experimental economics destroyed whatever was left in me in the notion that somehow you could do better than to find institutions that organize decentralized information. And I want to talk about that. When I look at competition agencies, antitrust agencies, the field where I'm coming from, I don't think that they simply, again, organize decentralized information. They would do so by protecting the emergence of different business models, such as Web3. But instead, what you see is that they show teeth by regulating existing business models. And we have lots of examples of that. Recent examples include the Digital Markets Act in Europe and other regulations in the US. Now, the question is, why do they do that? And I would think that agencies have a better incentive to regulate what exists already because it's politically more rewarding. So here's my question. As the former president of the Public Choice Society, I'd love to hear from you on what it would take to limit what agencies can do and to put them on track to indeed simply organize decentralized information. Which kind of mechanisms do we need? Where should we start?
Well, if you read chapter 7 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith is describing the higgling and bargaining process among buyers and sellers in a market. And out of that, that early forms of bargaining, bilateral and multilateral bargaining described there, grew things like the oral outcry double auction and its electronic forms. And you see, my first experiment implemented the oral outcry two-sided auction. One of our first projects when we went electronic in 1975 at the University of Arizona was, and I had a student, Arlington Williams, who programmed the first electronic double auction trading system. And we know it's the first because he finished that program. He started in the fall of 75. He finished in the spring of 1976. And I remember the Toronto Stock Exchange announcing, and it was, I think, around July, it was that following summer, that they were implementing the first electronic trading system on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Interestingly, their idea was to use that for the thinly traded stocks. None of the dealers wanted to give up the heavily traded ones. But they created an institution that ate them up, that just gobbled them up. That's, you see, they thought they could create this institution and control it, but no, it became part of of people's way of thinking. Other business models started to do variations on it, and pretty soon you had the personalized trading at posts and among dealers gradually giving away to purely electronic trading. And and you know, I've seen that happen in my lifetime. Heard brokers and dealers saying at the time that this would never happen because no one would want to give up their control and their control of the trading to machines. But once that institution was created, you see, it then had a life of its own, and it ended up doing away with the post trading at the New York Stock Exchange. It did away with the commodity pits in Chicago, the futures commodity pits, all very physical layouts, everything done. The resolution of the trades to make sure the total amount bought was total was equal to what was sold. That had to be done in the pit before people left. All of that now is done, of course, electronically and errorlessly. You see, and it's just completely taken over that. And there's many different forms of it, of course, and then and supplements to it. You have now, before the New York Stock Exchange opens, you have electronic futures market on the open, and you had hand run or a personal interaction run such markets before the electronic age, but now all those have been taken over. And so we have it now almost right when the market closes, we have an aftermarket, and as well as a foremarket before it opens. So now markets are virtually continuous. You can trade anytime. Okay, any of the listed securities or commodities. So these institutions, which are just really collections of algorithms, ways of implementing the detailed means by which people interact with each other and making trades, all of that has been taken over by institutions. And I think something like comparable to that you'll see happening on Web3, you see, because it's just it's an open platform, and you know, basically what you need to do is to facilitate on Web3 the beneficent actions that people can take, and also have where you need regulation or some sort of control is to limit the bad things that people can do to each other. See, that's the part that, and of course, Adam Smith was very much aware of the asymmetry between gains and losses. That's a very, of course, modern theme in psychology. Well, Adam Smith had that in 1759. And you see the amount by which we can rise from any given state, he says, is small relative to the amount by which we can fall. And he gets this from the asymmetry between our joy and our sorrow. He derives the notion of an asymmetry between gains and losses. Uses it to account, for example, as to why the punishment is greater for theft and robbery than for violation of contract. He says violation of contract merely frustrates our expectation of gain. Theft and robbery take from us what we have already possessed. I mean, what an incredible insight, you see. He takes these simple propositions and gets big picture views of how society is organized out of them. And the modern psychology didn't do that. They've been pursuing the asymmetry between gains and losses as an empirical thing for quite some time. But they had no theory that was predictive of that. In other words, they were discovering things empirically. Smith had a prediction model, you see, of these things, and it's why he's so powerful. And I think the creation of institutions out of in the form basically of rules and algorithms that will govern how we interact is an essential aspect of how the form in which human curiosity takes, that creates groups, you see, and that it produces groups, it produces a sort of the elements that explain collections that are themselves orderly and at a higher level than just the order that comes from individuals interacting with others. And that's been going on a long time in the human enterprise, and we're just seeing it. You know, the electronic age and the internet is just, and Web3 is going to be a wonderful example, you see, where we're going to observe that playing out. It'll be scholars need to study that are aware of who think like Adam Smith. The people who think like Adam Smith need to study this new institution and what comes out of it.
So, talking about scholars, and this will be the last substantial questions before I ask you some more personal ones, but talking about scholars, and this will be the last time I quote you, you once said that the major problem in economic theory is a preoccupation with modeling for its own sake and not asking the fundamental questions. And you went on to say that these fundamental questions have to do with dynamics and property rights. So if we talk about dynamics for a minute, you are, of course, well known for having introduced experimental economics, which by definition deals with dynamics. Now, I wonder if you will share the same views as George Akerlof, who recently published a short article entitled The Sins of Emissions, in which the conclusion is that economics as a discipline ignore important topics and problems because it insists too much on static ways and what he calls hard ways, meaning here algebra and quantitative methods, as opposed to more qualitative methods that are so dear to Adam Smith and a few others, of course, like Joseph Schumpeter, but is not the only one. So would you share the same view that we have neglected dynamics for too long? And if so, how can we change that? Which kind of incentive do we need to change the economic field and push towards more dynamic studies?
Well, I think what's important is that our focus should be on the actors in any system we're modeling. The focus should be on the actors and on the actions they take from their perspective. You see, that's not what we tend to do. We don't model the buyers and sellers in a market. We model our representations of buyers and sellers as maximizing agents. You see, well, that maximization should be something. If it's a property of what goes on in a market, it should come out of the interaction of the participants in the market, not sort of imposed on the way we interpret their actions from the outside. In other words, a model of that, and that's the way I would describe it. But I think Akerlof, he's emphasizing the limitation of the mathematics, and well, that's correct, but the limitation is in the thinking first, and not in the mathematics. In fact, my co-author Sabu Inawa and I, on our recent book on the economics of markets, we mathematize chapter 7 of The Wealth of Nations, because that's about price discovery. And Smith says that when sellers bring too little to the market, more buyers want to buy at the seller's cost than can be satisfied, and so buyers bid up the price. Well, that's a dynamic statement. It's a statement that when prices start too low, there's excess demand and buyers act to raise prices. And then if prices start too high, it's the reverse, and sellers tend to compete in lowering their asking prices. In other words, although it's a both sides are involved, there is at low prices, it's the buyers that are aggressive in raising price, and when there's too much, the sellers are the aggressive ones in lowering price. And it turns out that is you can see that happening in the double auction in the experiments. With the prominence with which buyers versus sellers taking actions being determined by whether there's excess demand or excess supply. Well, you get this out of in the experiments. You get it by just seeing what the buyers and sellers do, the actions they take, and we have complete records of that. And you see this remarkable playing out of the kind of principles that Smith is narrating, a verbal description of what's going on in that market, and you can. So you have, how do you model that mathematically? Well, you say that price change and excess demand have the same sign. So if excess demand is positive, the price change is positive. If it's negative, the price change is negative. So you can put that of mathematics, but under that is a very precise and careful thought process that leads to that particular mathematization. And so, see, with Smith, you have less of a, well, there's equilibrium and supply equals demand. It's not clear that Adam Smith even believed that because he saw markets as very much always in motion, you see, and adapting and changing, or adapting to change. And that theme, well, where I first learned of it was really from Hyde, his really tremendous AER 1945 AER article on having to do with the pricing system as an information system. Well, actually, all of that is in the Wealth of Nations, but the language is different because he didn't have the sort of the language of information theory that we have now, but it's clearly about information. It's about finding prices and those prices becoming public. And what was hidden before in a buyer's private willingness to pay, a seller's private willingness to accept, that hidden information, you see, a close approximation to that information is made public because the price that you and I negotiate, you're the buyer and I'm the seller, we're negotiating a price, and that price is between your maximum willingness to pay and my willingness to accept. And so that becomes public information. And if all of that was private, you see, it would be very much limit our dynamic decisions as to what it is that we want, what direction to orient our skills, our direction of learning. All of that is influenced by these prices that have to do with that characterize all output and input markets, and very much, and we don't even think about it. Yet we are very much influenced by all of that. And I think what we're going to see in Web3 will be a playing out of this human capacity, you see, to invent new things because we are collectives interacting, and as a group we create, as well as individuals create new things. So yes, and I just think it's so important in modeling to focus on the principles that are involved in any social or market or group situation. What are the focus on the principles and the actions they take, and try to take their perspective, learn by observation and learning, which is what Adam Smith did, to take their perspective. And he had huge data sets available to him that we don't think of. He had all of the literature. He had stage plays and Roman and Greek literature, and these all capture, you see, a lot of the history and protocols of the time in them. And Smith was thoroughly familiar, you see, with those. And so these became kind of cases or examples that helped to discipline his theory. You see, because he'll state a proposition, and then he will start to go through the examples, cases that are consistent with that, and then he will look to see if there's contrary cases, and then try to explain the contrary cases and why they're contrary, but don't really violate the general principle. You see this sort of thought process going on in Adam Smith if you read him carefully. And I'll tell you what, you have to revisit, you have to read him over and over again because it's hard. It's hard because the thought process is one that, and And of course, some of the 18th century King's English is unfamiliar to us. And we have words that he used that we don't use anymore, like approbation and disapprobation. Approbation meant kind of a group or community consent, not only individual consent. Approbation had this sort of collective consent property. And because he was everywhere describing the rules we follow, not because just you and I find those rules productive, but all third-party observers agree. So he's bringing in third parties, you see, and external attitudes, and creating, you see, this notion of a consent process out of that. And these principles are going to be operating in Web3, you see, and in anything that humans do.
So I want to conclude talking about you, if that's okay. I have 4 very short questions, and I'm sure this will be of interest to everyone watching or listening to us. The first of which is the following. You were awarded the Nobel Prize 21 years ago. And so I'm wondering now, more than 2 decades after receiving the prize, what you think has been the greatest benefits coming out of it?
Well, I guess the benefit to me has been the sense of approval that came from that, that has an objective existence beyond your immediate friends and associates. And this I think is the Nobel Prize has been particularly, I think, important in that respect, and one of the reasons why it has become considered so prestigious. And I think the Nobel committees in the past have done their homework really quite well in recognizing sometimes controversial figures. Ike was controversial because he was seen as he was seen politically as a conservative, which I think he wasn't. And everybody needs to read his essay on why I'm not a conservative.
I was about
which
to
he
say.
felt it was important to write at the time of the Nobel, because we have these popular simplified ways of categorizing people that in many ways don't help at all. They divert attention away from what's really important. So I think it was important from that point of view, and for a while it kind of in a way diverted me from my work and continuing it, because I did a lot of speaking and traveling. But I basically used those opportunities to talk about what I was doing, and I didn't range out into popular themes, and even although I sometimes commented on them, if I could relate it to kind of my own, my work, my experimental work. So I tried to make, in general audiences, tried to convey some of the content and thinking and motivation in laboratory experiments and why these were important in economics, even though at the time it's not what economists did. You know, someone has said that economics is what economists do. Well, it wasn't economics because others weren't doing it. Well, that changed, of course, and to me it was very exciting because for the first time I had a way of testing what it was that I thought I knew, and I hadn't been brought up with that way of thinking in my formal education. And the first experiment falsified everything I'd been taught, thought, and believed. Because, you know, we believed that for a competitive market to prevail, you had to have a large number of buyers and sellers. They had to have complete information. Everybody had to be small relative to total. All of that. None of that was true. You could give me 2 or 3 people, and I can characterize their supply and demand graphs. Help to characterize what it is they do. And so my thinking was, you see, totally changed by that, and that's why I sort of got caught up and drawn into that. So I think the lessons here for students is to you know, and if you're doing not experimental but empirical work, think in terms of the agents that are out there. Try to understand more about business as business persons, government regulation and rules as persons doing this, and how do they think about their task? Why is it that regulation tends to bring together the regulators and the regulated, and they begin to look at things in similar ways? And so you have actually, you're not thinking about, you're thinking about business and regulating business. You're not thinking about the consumer. Well, that's what it's all for, supposedly. You see, and so I think that's what's important for young economists to do that are studying economics is don't be afraid to learn a lot about what economic agents actually do, and think about how you would model them, and then see if what they're doing, once you get models, is that efficient? Well, it probably is, but the point is that's not why they do them. You know, that was Adam Smith's critique of David Hume, was that he thought the reason why we follow these rules of property was because of the inconvenience of not doing it. Smith said he had no doubt about what these were efficient, but people are not aware. That's important to I think for young scholars to do, while at the same time being interested in the big picture, how all of this gives you a comprehension of the big picture that we wouldn't otherwise have.
In Why I'm Not a Conservative, Hayek explains that he is not in his own views because he doesn't want to just resist change, but wants to offer a new path, which is certainly what you've done as well in your work. Now, to everyone out there, there is another one that I will recommend by another Nobel laureate, and that's James Buchanan, who published a book saying entitled "Why I Too Am Not a Conservative." Also, quite good. But coming back to you, the following question I have is: so, what's a typical day for Vernon Smith? Do you have any routines, things you do to get in the mood, or is every day its own discovery?
Well, no, I have my routine when I wake up, which is usually somewhere between 5:30 and 6. I get up and I turn on the coffee. My wife has prepared the coffee the night before, and I just go out and turn it on, uh, unlock the house, the electronic locking system. I turn that off, and I come back to bed and I do my correspondence then using an iPad pad. I read my correspondence and do a fair amount of it then. I can't do it all because I may need to send documents or something like that. So I do that when I get to into my office, my home office, which is right across the living room from the bedroom. And I'm in my home office then by about 7:30, something like that. And well, I have from time to time interruptions in the day. I usually go downstairs. I've got an oval machine, and so I do some exercise and a little bit of also some weights. So I try to stay in reasonably good physical condition. I go to a Pilates therapist twice a week and do Pilates exercises followed by a massage. And the Pilates exercises focus on balance because I have deteriorating balance. And in older people, why that exposes you to falls, and that can be very debilitating. So I try to maintain an exercise regime that involves focusing on muscles that will help balance. And if I do go down, I'm uh, I'm able to protect myself better. So this is the sort of thing you do when you're 96 years old and want to remain active. But most of my time is sitting right here where I am now at my desk. And I finished a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, the book Humanomics with Bart Wilson, and then just this last year, a book on the economics of markets, and that's basically classical versus neoclassical models of markets. We finished that last year, and I'm working on a manuscript. I think the title will be The Wisdom of Adam Smith Day by Day. It'll be 366 entries that are quotations from Adam Smith, mostly the theory of moral sentiments, but also the lectures on jurisprudence and some from the Wealth of Nations. And these are, I'd like to try to give people an easy way, a step-by-step way of getting into reading Adam Smith, because they're big books and uh, they're very hard. It's hard to get people, I think, to commit and to even appreciate the relevance of that reading to their world today. And so my idea is to do it in a daily readings. I got this idea, C.S. Lewis, there is a book on C.S. Lewis that involves daily readings, and I think, and of course he was an extremely prolific writer, publisher of many books. The number in Smith is very small, but they're also very compact and have a lot in them. So that's what I'm working on now, and it's pretty challenging, actually, to get on each entry a short title that really captures. A title needs to be a kind of mini abstract, you see, and then a quotation, and then follow-up comment in my own words. That's sort of the model I'm doing. And well, it's been great, very beneficial to me, because I am now, I think, very appreciative of the pattern of thinking and some of his methodological principles that I've come to find very easy to use and apply and think with. And of course, I'm a latecomer to the theory of moral sentiments. I cited it the first time in the early 1990s. And I go back and read that, and I realize how little I understood at the time about the theory of moral sentiments. And it isn't that what I said was wrong, it's just that it wasn't very deep, is the point. And so it's been a great, and it nicely ties up with experimental methods. And Adam Smith would have loved laboratory experimental methods, because he was an experimental thinker, and he uses the word experiment. Both he and David Hume use the word experiment, and by that they mean cases, examples that potentially challenge their theoretical models. And in fact, David Hume refers to it as the experimental way of thinking, or kind of experimental theorizing. So anyway, it's I think these are important ways that young scholars can self-develop and to develop sort of kind of a methodology for developing themselves. That's, because it's every paper in economics tends to begin with another paper. That's why it's so path dependent. You see, but it's important to think outside of that, and for young scholars to ask them, why am I doing this? What yes, I need to publish, but why do I need to publish these particular kinds of thinking, or kinds of papers? Think about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and the big issues in in economics and society.
If I may ask one very final question. So besides drinking coffee around 5 to 5:30 a.m., which by the way I'm incapable of doing, what's your secret to staying active here? I mean, on the professional level, and to stay so relevant at indeed 96 years old. What are you? What's the secret? We want to know.
Well, I often say that I chose my ancestors very carefully.
Mm.
Three of my four grandparents lived into the 90s. My father and his brother didn't, but they were smokers. So the first rule is don't smoke.
Okay.
And I never have, and I think so. My father had good inheritance, but he sort of blew it by becoming a lifetime smoker. He finally, I mean, he did quit in his early 50s, and he lived about another 10 years, but I think the damage was done then.
Mm.
So, and I want to live because there's so much to do. Adam Smith died at age 67. If he'd lived to my age, he'd lived 30 years longer. His great work on the theory of jurisprudence would have been completed.
Yeah.
You see, that was a lifelong ambition to bring it all together into a theory of jurisprudence, because he saw jurisprudence, the rules that we follow, as central to the whole, to understanding the human enterprise. And the nearest that we have to that, his ideas there, are in his lectures on jurisprudence, which fortunately he was a popular lecturer at the University of Glasgow, and he lectured not only to students, but he gave a set of lectures that involved both students and people from the town of Glasgow. So he had connections in academic connections in Glasgow, and was very much interested in those ideas being made available to curious merchants, you see, and others in the town of Glasgow. And we've lost that in academia. We've lost that connection, that there's this town versus gown separation, and they were integrated in Adam Smith's time. And so he was a popular lecturer, and a really good set of notes would be handwritten notes on his lectures, which cardboard bound, you see, and tied together. There was a market for those in the town of Glasgow. Well, about 1895, a set of these notes came on the market from an estate sale and were auctioned. And then another set in the early 30s. And these were all the lectures he was giving on jurisprudence at the time. So that gives us some insight into his articulation of the principles of jurisprudence, and it involved theory and history, because he always was because in a way the changing line in history was part of the evidence that a model ought to be able to take care of, you see. So we had these notes, and so that's a really, those two sets of notes have been now extensively annotated, and we have these lectures, and those are very, I think, very good in terms of giving you an idea of jurisprudence. Almost all personal law is based on slavery, women, and children. Those three things: slavery, women, and children, is the source of a lot of huge amount of personal law, and we don't think of it that way now. So reading Adam Smith is really very informative.
So I gather then, indeed, reading Adam Smith might be your secret for staying active and so relevant at age 96. I also want to point out to your biography that a short version of it that you wrote for the Nobel committee that is on the Nobel Prize website. I found that to be fascinating. On that note, Vernon, thank you so very much for making the time, for all the insights. And on that, to everyone out there, take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.